Good evening. I have the privilege of starting us off tonight. And wow, what a great looking group of people. Thank you for coming. Such a beautiful day outside. I was kind of wondering on the way over how many people would prefer to be out at Snake River having a beer outside. But you made it here, and we're thankful for that. We're going to have a great program tonight. And I'd just like to start with some introductions before I turn it over to our MC. So first, the thank yous. I'd like to thank Greater Yellowstone Coalition and the Eco Tours Adventure for helping us sponsor tonight. And that's a huge contribution. And then also to point out our board members that Mountain Journal has that also helped sponsor tonight's event. I think I have two people here in the room. Sandra Lambert, I saw you in the back. There you are. Say hello. And David Cook, are you in the audience? Oh, yay, okay. So hopefully you'll get a chance to speak with either or both of them. They're wonderful. So tonight, the purpose we have designed is really, pardon that little cough, I will confess I had a bowl of the Snake River chili on the way over here. So you know what that means. We're going to learn from some knowledgeable people that are in the scientific realm who have spent a lot of their lives studying biology, ecosystems, climatology, paleoclimatology, things I don't even understand. And we're going to have a wonderful time with them tonight in conversation. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because we have in common in this room a great sense of purpose and value with this community and this ecosystem that we're living in. And we are blessed every day to go outside and look at these glorious mountains and wander up into Yellowstone and see wildlife unlike anywhere else in North America. So this is a pretty spectacular place. And as we travel around, we see people from all over the world that understand and come here because they have a deep understanding of this being something that's not common. And so we're here to talk a little bit about the biology around that and the preservation of these amazing national parks that we're near. At Mountain Journal, we believe in nonprofit independent journalism. What does that mean? Well, we believe that journalism has a critical role in every community, just like water. It's important for us to be able to rely upon the information we receive and know that it's factual, know that it's fact-based, science-based, and legitimately researched and presented. So that's what our mission is, and we specifically focus that energy on Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, all the way down from Yellowstone to here, and as it happens, to look at all of the areas in between, which might come up tonight. We believe that journalism is a critical role for us to fulfill a betterment of our lives based on fact-based, non-biased, independent writers, and we'll hear a little bit about that program tonight. We endeavor to bring to you, as readers of Mountain Journal, journalism about Greater Yellowstone. What are the challenge areas? You know what they are. There's growth, there's fire, there's water issues, there's wildlife corridor issues, there's interaction with top predators that wander out of the parks, and there's interaction with surrounding communities. How do we make it all work? Well, certainly one of the ways that we have to focus on is to make sure that we're having conversations like tonight. So we humbly ask for your support in our endeavors. We've been in business as a nonprofit 501c3 for 6 years. We had a wonderful founder, probably many of you know, and we've also got a new leader now in Joseph O'Connor, who I will introduce to you in a minute. But we're lean and mean. We've got 1.5 full-time employees, and we rely on our readers to keep us going, and we also rely on you to tell us what you're interested in. So hopefully that can happen as well tonight. Contributors from this community make it happen, and I can't say that enough that we cannot do this without your support. So tonight you'll see an opportunity to donate, and I would humbly ask for you to consider doing that to Mountain Journal. Currently, we have 260,000 followers. We have 25 new independent writers that are writing through Joe's care and tutelage as our managing editor. And we have 7,000 newsletter subscribers that look at our newsletter every time we send one out. 50 new stories about the community year to date and growing. So help us grow, help us remain sustainable, and let's enjoy ourselves tonight. I'd like to now move to introducing our managing editor, Joseph O'Connor, and come on up here, Joe, to be our MC tonight. Joe hails from a number of wonderful institutions, including Harvard University. He's done top journalism in the Montana arena, where he joined us from Mountain Outlaws not too long ago, about a year and a half. And he has brought to Mountain Journal a wonderful cadre of talent to write for us. Welcome, Joe O'Connor.
Thank you, Hank. Wow, thanks for coming, everybody. Really appreciate you guys coming out here tonight. We're going to have a terrific conversation for you. I want to thank, in addition to Hank, our board chair, thanks to the Mountain Journal Board of Directors, just for your unyielding support, especially for me over the last year and a half. And thank you to our sponsors for tonight's special event, Greater Yellowstone Coalition and Jackson Eco Tour Adventures, who have made it possible for us to make this event free of charge for all of you. So if we could just give a round of applause to our board of directors and our sponsors, thank you very much. These are trying times in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. On a number of fronts, it's heating up. We're grappling with complex issues such as wildlife and wildlands preservation, conflict between wildlife and humans, apex predator management for keystone species such as grizzly bears and wolves, and a warming climate that's affecting every management decision we make. Mountain Journal launched in 2017, a journalism project founded by Rick Reese, Mike Clark, and Todd Wilkinson. At MoJo, we're challenged with bringing these issues and more to you so that we can all better understand the science and data that informs the decisions we make. From the voting booth to our day-to-day decisions to our children's future. MoJo is a nonprofit digital magazine covering the wildlife and wildlands in Greater Yellowstone. We aim to bring you, as Hank said, fact-based journalism, articles rooted in science, to give you the opportunity to gain further insight into this truly amazing space. It's comprised of more than 22 million acres, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. In the lobby and ahead of the show, you've noticed some slides with some weird-looking squares. I don't think they're up there right now, but they were earlier. Those are QR codes. You can scan them with your camera and on your cell phone. And the first, you can sign up for our free newsletter that we send out weekly, MoJo articles delivered to your email inbox. The second is a chance to support us. We do depend on you, our readers, for funding so that we can continue to bring you independent public interest journalism. So thank you very much for your support. As Hank also mentioned, I'm Joe O'Connor, managing editor for Mountain Journal. You may recognize me from a little-known documentary that actually screened here last week at the Center for the Arts called 399, Queen of the Tetons. You may have heard of it. Yes, I had a small cameo in the film. And yes, I had no idea I was going to be in it. I heard about it, or I found out when I was watching it a few weeks ago, and thought, well, that's interesting. I even got a film credit, filming assistance furnished by Joseph T. O'Connor. I have no idea what that means. So to the director and the producers of what was actually an excellent film, I'll be here waiting patiently for my royalties, or at least a credit on IMDb. I'm honored to take the stage tonight with these three incredible panelists, and I want to thank them for coming. The format for tonight's event, just so you all know, will feature short presentations for context by each of our three panelists. Then we'll sit down for discussion, and we'll end the evening with an audience Q&A session where you can ask panelists questions of your own. In the $3.99 film, I was interviewing Dr. Christopher Servheen in 2021. It was a town hall event on grizzly bears. Dr. Servheen was the grizzly bear recovery coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 35 years. He's president of the Montana Wildlife Federation. He has a PhD in zoology and wildlife biology, and he's one of the preeminent bear experts in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Dr. Chris Servheen.
Thanks, Joe, and welcome, everybody. It's good to see that this many people wanted to get out of that beautiful sunshine out there and come sit in this dark theater. We're surprised. Hopefully we make it worth your while. What we're going to do tonight is talk about these things. As Joe said, we want a conversation about the issues related to bears, wolves, and climate change in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and hopefully highlight some of the problems that are out there. This is the current distribution of grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and in green there. And when the Grizzly Bear Recovery Program started in 1981, there were hardly any bears outside that yellow line there. And in fact, the majority of the bears were in Yellowstone National Park back in 1981. And you can see that they've come a long way. They're south of Lander now. They're almost, well, they're around Bozeman, and a tremendous distribution of bears today. We've come a long way from where we were when we thought they were going to be gone. And I think it's important to point out here that we have grizzly bears here where 399 is, but at the time we started the recovery program in 1981, there were just occasional bears in Grand Teton, and very few bears in the south here at all. And if it wasn't for the Endangered Species Act and the Grizzly Bear Recovery Program, there wouldn't be grizzly bears here in Jackson Hole today. So there's a lot of talk about grizzly bears related to their recovery and their delisting. And I want to highlight some of these issues briefly. Essentially, for what the Endangered Species Act says is you have to have enough habitat for the animals that are out there. That habitat has to be properly managed. You have to have sufficient numbers of animals across the landscape and so that they occupy all the habitat that is available for them. And most importantly, you have to have adequate habitat and mortality regulatory mechanisms in place so that if the Endangered Species Act wasn't in place, that the bears would still be around. Grizzlies are still at risk. Even though we have more than 1,000 grizzly bears today in the Yellowstone ecosystem, they are still at risk because of a simple problem. Most people, particularly politicians, think that if you've got a lot of bears, then the bears are recovered. But that's not true. The numbers of bears in and of themselves are not sufficient to delist and recover the grizzly bears. And what we're at risk today is the actions of regulatory mechanisms that are controlling mortality across the landscape for grizzly bears. Many of those put in place to try to kill wolves, incidentally, that we have across the landscape. And the states have been leaders in this effort to try and reduce wolf populations to the absolute minimum numbers. And we see that there are ways put on the landscape that are put in place to kill wolves that are in fact killing grizzly bears too. The greatest threat to grizzly bears today is the politicians in the state legislatures and the governors who are passing legislation to implement harmful regulations that are basically anti-predator policies that are not based on science and they're not based on fact. And some of those things that are in place right now, neck snaring for wolves where grizzly bears are present, and we have grizzly bears that have been caught in these around the neck and killed. Hound hunting for black bears where grizzly bears are present. That was illegal in Montana for 100 years until the legislature made it legal in 2021. Wolf traps and snares with bait where grizzly bears are present and when grizzly bears are out of the den. So they're still out and vulnerable to these traps and snares. Paying people to kill wolves, which happens in Idaho and Montana, which is essentially a bounty, which takes us back to the 1800s. And in fact, people don't even have to kill wolves to be paid. They can just go out and submit receipts that they went out and tried to kill wolves, and they can be reimbursed. Shooting wolves over bait at night with spotlights and night vision devices. When you're shooting things at night, you really know what you're shooting most of the time. And finally, the issue of demonizing predators and making predators something that are evil in the minds of the public. And horrible things happen when that demonization takes place. We saw that recently in Wyoming. So in summary, we have a success story with the grizzly bear recovery effort. We've got over 1,000 grizzly bears up in here in what's called the Northern Continental Divide population. Here's Glacier Park. We've got over 1,000 grizzly bears down here in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And these two bear populations are about 60 miles apart. They're very close to connecting naturally. But if you look at these light red areas on this map, these are the places where grizzly bears are present. There are grizzly bears on the landscape. And in many of the areas where you see this pointer, the legislatures are putting hound hunting of black bears on top of these grizzly bears. They're putting out neck snares and wolf traps with bait while grizzly bears are out of the den. And those activities have the potential to make us go into reverse in the whole recovery program. And we're entering dark times with the grizzly bear. We've come a long way in recovery, and unfortunately now we're seeing a reversal due to politics and politicians. And when politicians make decisions about wildlife, bad things happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate that. Dr. Douglas Smith served as senior wildlife biologist at Yellowstone National Park for nearly 3 decades and has been studying wolves for more than 40 years. He has a PhD in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology and is the author of multiple publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Smith.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for the invitation. It's always great to come to Jackson, which is a vibrant conservation community, and it's even more special to be sandwiched between these two great colleagues and scientists and biologists. So tough position to be in. My talk's going to not be as polished as Chris's was, and I'm going to say a few things, and then I'm going to flick through my slides. But the two things, and that was a great tee-up for me, that Chris did, because that talk was I thought it would be 100% about bears, and it was about bears and wolves and predators and kind of the culture and values around predators, which was very important lead-off talk. And so what I would like to do is make 2 overarching points about wolves and then dive in with a couple other minor points. And first, a lot of wolf management is driven by their biology. Wolves are the only social carnivore in North America, You know, there might be some others that are close. Coyotes are pairs and the pups leave in the fall. But they're social carnivores with a high reproductive rate that are fairly resilient against human-caused mortality. And we use those features of their life history to have very aggressive management for them. In other words, you can kill them at a high rate and they bounce back, at least demographically or from a population standpoint. Their social dynamics have been less studied and they're less resilient to that kind of mortality. But with their high reproductive rate, most management is geared towards trying to keep the wolf population in check. And you see that in all 3 states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And it's manifested in different forms. In Wyoming, it's the predator zone. In Idaho and Montana, it's the liberal regulations killing them, which essentially function similarly to a predator zone because killing wolves is so unregulated. So their biology dictates a lot of our response to them. That's my first point. My second is a lot of wolf management deals with what are you able to get? What is reasonable to want? Me, as a career wolf biologist, has always wanted better management, but society won't let you get there. So much of what you can manage for with wolves is limited by social acceptance, which is linked to if you don't do something, pretty soon you're going to have wolves everywhere. So balancing that biology with social acceptance has been an age-old problem for wolves. The historic solution is to kill them at a high rate. As some colleagues of mine who have said, who are very famous, you can have more wolves in more places if you're willing to kill them. So that is a problem that has been with wolf management all along. Those are my 2 main points that I want you to remember. But you can't talk about wolves unless you talk about elk, because elk are iconic in the tri-state region, in Wyoming. They're the gods of this country. And the GYE, 22 million acres, as Joe said, is the largest intact temperate zone ecosystem in the world. But you got to think about that, especially in Jackson, because it's 70% public land and 30% private. Many people, including administrators, say that means the future is bright. The area is protected as public land. We're okay. The flip argument is a third of that area is private and the population is growing there, development is growing there, and that's going to affect the other 70% as the most intact temperate zone ecosystem in the world, which, by the way, estimated elk populations for the entire region is 140 to 170,000 elk. In that same area, there's 400,000 to 700,000 cattle. So this is the most intact temperate zone ecosystem in the world, and you've got 3 times as many cattle as you do elk. And the future for those elk isn't bright, because as you'll hear from our next speaker, climate change scenarios have less severe winters, which could help elk, but you also could have drier summers, which will hurt the time of year when elk foraging needs to be at its maximum to increase their condition. And this is leaving out future projections of chronic wasting disease. Altogether, the future for elk is 50% predicted less. Overlay wolves on top of that, and that's a very controversial situation. So between tolerance and biology, between wolves, we need a better dialogue about wolf management, as Chris emphasized. And so, as I said, I'll be uneven here. This area has one of the greatest concentrations, both in terms of abundance and diversity, of large carnivores as you'll find anywhere in North America. So that is a real management onus for you folks. Chris already mentioned there's 22 million acres, mostly public land, but not all. And so depending upon your viewpoint, that can be hopeful or pessimistic. But this is a figure from Andy Hansett at Montana State, and this is all the roads in the GYE. So for the most intact temperate zone ecosystem in the world, that to me causes me to worry. If that's the best we've got, and that's the access, and access is always the Achilles heel for carnivores, then we need to proceed very carefully. And we also need to proceed very carefully. This is Shoshone National Forest. You've probably all seen this a few years ago because of attitudes like this. So much of wolves, as Chris eloquently pointed out, is dependent upon human tolerance. And the last slide and this slide are cause for concern and thought. This is the elk slide. It's a little dated. It shows elk when wolves were reintroduced in the mid-90s, elk a few years ago. The blue is population size for the tri-state area. The brown is harvest rate. And wolves have not impacted statewide elk populations or harvest. But yet you'll hear that all the time in the papers. Chris pointed that out, the misinformation. So wolf management is never black and white. We go from no protection based on human tolerance to complete protection depending upon your view. Where are you on that management spectrum? It's really hard to find the middle. That's where I've tried to live professionally. I lean a little bit more towards the protection side personally. I can say that now, not working for the government, but finding that middle ground with wolves is hard. And so one of the things I tried to do, and I think one of the more important things I did in my career, was talk to people who do not think like you or agree with you. I grew up riding. I rode into outfitter camps and tried to talk about people who ride the mountains with guns about wolves. And I think, again, we need more of that dialogue. And so how do you talk to someone who doesn't think or agree with you? As Daniel Kahneman, who just passed away, said, no one ever made a decision because of a number. That's what I've essentially done my entire career, is try and put a number on things. They need a story. I talk about horses. I talk about rifles. Those are the common ground things. And then you bring up wolves, because wolves need conversation between different types of people. Thank you very much.
He's got the passion, doesn't he? That's good. We need that. Last but not least, Dr. Cathy Whitlock is recognized for her work in paleoclimatology and paleoecology and is a Regents Professor Emerita at Montana State University. She was lead author of both the 2017 Montana Climate Assessment and the 2021 Greater Yellowstone Climate Assessment. A member of the National Academy of Sciences with a PhD in geological sciences, Dr. Whitlock's studies of past wildfire activity have helped reveal long-term linkages between fire, climate, and humans in temperate regions around the world. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Cathy Whitlock.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to share the stage with Doug and Chris, and I also appreciate Joe and Mountain Journal for making this event possible. It's great, and I guess I have the unhappy responsibility of talking about climate change in this trio, because climate change is something that, of course, affects all of these issues, and something that needs to be dealt with as fast as possible. I want to highlight the Greater Yellowstone Climate Assessment. It came out in 2021. The information is still quite up to date. It's special because it's the first time there ever was a climate assessment of an ecosystem. And what a grand ecosystem to start with. It took a couple of years to do. It has many collaborators involved in writing it. And for the first time, it focuses on the six major watersheds of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem: the Missouri, the Upper Yellowstone, the Bighorn, the Upper Green, the Snake, and the Snake headwaters and the Upper Snake. I'm also like that it focuses on past climate change, current climate change and future climate change. So past takes us all the way back to the last ice age and beyond. But we spent a lot of time thinking about what happened since 1950, and there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the reasons I think is that some of us were around in 1950s, and it's really important that what we see on the landscape makes sense in light of what is being measured on the landscape. So here's some information since 1950. It's gotten warmer in the Greater Yellowstone. It's gotten about 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer now than it was in 1950. And there's a lot less snow, especially these snow stations. Most of the snow stations are at 8,000 feet, so there's a lot less snow below 8,000 feet, 24 inches on average per year since 1950. But the biggest change, and this is the one that gets to wolves and grizzly bears, I think, is that we've seen a real change in the season of precipitation. It's not so much that precipitation has changed, but it's the season of precipitation has changed. And so what we see now is that there's a lot less precipitation in the winter and in the summer, but there's more precipitation in the spring and in the fall. And that change in seasonality has a big impact for our ecosystem and how wildlife use it. So here's the projection for the future. So it goes from end of the century, it starts in 1900, and the horizontal line is the 1900 to 2005 average. The black line is the instrumented record for Greater Yellowstone, and then the blue line and the red line are trajectories of future climate change. You can see that as you go towards the future, the shading around those estimates gets broader and broader because there's a lot of uncertainties. The red line is an estimate that's hopefully extreme now. It's like what would happen if we don't reduce coal burning around the world very much. It's an extreme estimate, and more likely we're on that blue scenario where we make some changes and we start to flatten that curve. If we are on that blue line, we're about 4 to 5 to 6 degrees warmer in the Greater Yellowstone. If we're on that extreme case, we're 10 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. And when I look at this graph, I see my own life. My parents lived their life during the black curve. They didn't think about climate change very much. They didn't see very much climate change. Climate change went up and down. But us on the stage and some of you in the audience, we're going to live our lives maybe to 2050, and we're going to see nothing but warmer because that climate warming is already set in motion, and we're going to see sustained warming and probably reach about 4 degrees Fahrenheit by the middle of the century. It's our grandchildren that we really have to worry about because what we do now influences that final trajectory, what happens at the end of the century, whether we have a lot of warming or we actually can flatten the curve. Now, this warming in Greater Yellowstone is really important, not only for just heat stress, but also what it does to snow. And this is a graph that's in the assessment. It goes from 1950 to 2100, and it's the elevation of snow versus rain. So green is the elevation of rain dominance, blue is the elevation of snow dominance, and orange, red, and yellow is the kind of snow, rain, slush that we get a lot of this time of year and we really all hate. In 1950, snowline was at about 7,000 feet in the ecosystem, the elevation of reliable snow. By 2100, simply because it's getting warmer, that elevation is going to be at 9,000 to 10,000 feet. It's not that we're getting less precipitation, it's just that less of it is falling as snow. And so here's a map of our ecosystem, and remember, blue is the snow. So on the left you can see 1990, then 2030, 2050, 2070, 2090. Because it's warmer, we lose our snow. Now, all of this has a lot of implications for those of us that live in the Greater Yellowstone area and visit it, but the one tonight we're thinking about is ecological change. We know anytime in the past we see ecological change, the ecosystem adapts, the ecosystem changes. Species have to move on the landscape or adapt or they'll go extinct. And I think we're seeing some of that now. Grizzly bears are on the move. White bark pine populations have suffered severe mortality from bark beetles. We've seen the fires of 1988, but we've seen large fires somewhere in the West almost every year since. Wolverines are now protected under the Endangered Species Act because of the winter conditions. Wolves really depend on good snowpack, and they benefit from that. Cold water fish are being pushed up to higher elevations. And our ungulates are so tuned into the seasonality of the year and the timing of greening that they're going to be changing as well. So, you know, we're in for a lot, I think, and it's already happening before our eyes. So thank you.
Nice work, guys. Thank you. It's so nice to be sitting in this living room with you all this evening. It reminds me if we had a little fireplace, it'd be pretty nice. But yeah, we wanted to start this discussion part of the evening. Cathy, I'd love to start, with you, just based on what you've just talked about. The increase in temperature from 1950, and the fact that we have 2 feet less average snow than we did then is remarkable. Doug mentioned that climate change is causing a decline. It could cause a further decline in elk, due to climate change and disease. What are your thoughts on how climate is affecting and can affect elk specifically into the future? Because certainly, wolves and grizzly bears are a part of that as well.
Yeah, I'm really interested in picking these guys' brains about that because in my mind, so you can imagine that we have a longer fall going into the future, so that's going to affect things like, when bears go into hibernation and the sort of forage that's available. Summers are going to be drier, so there'll be less good quality forage, I think, by the end of the summer. Then you go into winters that are shorter. There's going to be, there'll be more rain, less snow. The snow won't last as long. It's going to come off faster. So that's going to affect hibernation, but it'll also affect the hunting ability of wolves and then the timing of green up and how that's going to impact ungulates. And then you go into this dry summer. And we've already seen some of this in recent years. So the forage isn't going to be good. And I just, I'd love to hear what these guys think about how that's going to impact wolves, elk, and grizzly bears.
Yeah, Doug, I'd love to hear, your thoughts on that. I mean, walk that out for wolves.
Yeah, I mean, how so much of how well wolves do depends on how well elk do. And, basically every winter's a survival test for elk. And so they just got to get through it. And the way they get through it is by capitalizing on the summer forage and green up. And so the snowpack helps sets the forage for the summer. That's the key part for the forage. There's a big debate over can rain make up for that? If it rains a lot, will that help get that amount of forage up? But the elk really need to get into good condition over the summer to go into winter so they can endure the winter again. And so this chart that Cathy showed about this less rain in summer could impact forage quality. Lower snowpack will impact forage quality. That's going to impact elk condition. We've seen that in Yellowstone already. When you have a dry summer, dry winter, I should say, it leads to poor forage quality, which has elk go into the fall period in poor condition. Mm-hmm. So that impacts pregnancy, that impacts the condition of bulls as they go into the rut, which makes them more vulnerable to wolf predation early in the winter. Mm-hmm. And so that climate signal ripples through the vegetation and the timing of it, which affects the condition of the elk, which affects the predation of the wolves. And elk, there's been some research done. There's a gradual shift on this. The migratory behavior of elk is designed to escape winter, but when it's summer, go to high elevation and seek out high quality forage, which lasts longer because it's higher and cooler and moister, and that's not happening as much as it used to. So the migratory behavior of elk, that strategy, that evolutionarily selected for strategy, is not working as well either. So all of these wolf-elk dynamics, if I can summarize it, are impacted by this climate pattern that's undergoing change, affecting condition of elk, affecting vulnerability of elk that wolves are responding to. And so it's in flux at the moment. We published a paper on that in 2020. And, it's a wild card of what the future is. So it's a very important interaction. And then bears, they're responding. They are dominant to wolves at carcasses. And so a lot of, if bears can't find whitebark pine, they move to wolf kills and take wolf kills when a food source becomes unavailable, like whitebark pine in the fall. So how climate impacts whitebark pine, cone crops, fire, which is going to burn whitebark pine, is another factor on the other side that I think will be very important as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Chris, I want to get to your thoughts in a second, but Cathy, you had...
Well, I wonder, so this year, for example, is the kind of year we've seen for the last few years where we don't get much snow in winter, and we're wondering what's going to happen. Are we going to get snow? And then we get a lot of snow in the spring, which is kind of the trend that I was showing. So the snow that comes is really wet, and it's heavy snow. It's hard to get through. Does that make a difference? When the snow falls and how much snow comes late?
I don't know.
I mean, it seems like it
seems like it would.
It would, right? I mean, because...
You were saying like wolves can walk on dense snow, and maybe...
In the back room, we were talking about the best time of year to be a wolf is late winter. Your prey is vulnerable, and you get a freeze-thaw cycle that turns the snow to concrete, and it's better walking than in the summer, over blowdowns and through shrubs and streams. When they get that hard surface of snow in late winter, and elk are having a hard time getting forage through it, having a hard time walking it, that's the single best time of year to be a wolf. Maybe the single worst time of year to be an elk. So what you just said, what it does to that period could be a game changer.
So, obviously, we've talked, and we were talking in the back a little bit about how, certainly wolves and grizzly bears are, apex predators, and they're very different all at the same time. Chris, I'm curious what, in your mind, expanding on what Cathy and Doug were talking about, what does it mean to have diminished elk numbers for grizzly bears?
Well, I think it's a really good question. I'm going to ask Doug this. If there's a more mild winter, wouldn't we have greater survival of elk populations, and they wouldn't be leaving the park and getting into trouble outside the park? They'd be staying in there. So would we have more elk if we have climate change and less precipitation in the winter?
I think that, in my view, and from what I know, the critical time for an elk is summer, because every winter is a survival test. So better winters make the test easier and probably increase survival, but it's still going to be a time of challenge for an elk. What elk need to do, both bulls and cows, is have a good summer. And so if summer conditions are compromised, that sets you up poorly for the next winter. And so I think in a way, from what I know about elk, which is certainly not complete, is that summer period is going to be really important. And the winter period can be helpful because the test is less severe, but I don't know if it's that significant in my view. Yeah.
So as you know, grizzly bears take advantage of elk carcasses when there's winter kill. There's a bad winter, then you get elk carcasses that are available to the bears in the spring when they come out. if there's going to be, I don't know the answer to this. Do you think there'd be more or fewer carcasses at the end of the winter?
I mean, I think, well, in terms of wolves and cougars too, the predator community now is fully restored in this region. And that, at least in Yellowstone, has led to fewer elk. And that has led to less winter die-off. And so a fully restored carnivore community kind of smooths out. And bison are changing because there's so many more bison now. There's a lot of winter-killed bison. But in terms of elk, compared to 30 years ago, the winter kill is much less. And wolves and cougars have kind of smoothed this big glut of dead things at the end of winter out and made it more a year-round supply of food, but it's not a glut at any one time. It's more spread out. And I don't know what that's doing to grizzly bears, because grizzly bears come out of their dens, they hit those winter kills. There has been less of that, more bison because of the bison situation, but the bears have a year-round, for lack of a better way of saying it, smorgasbord now. And they tend to win at battles over carcasses, so they'll just take a carcass from the bears.
And you talk about 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there were a lot fewer bears than there are now, too. So fewer elk carcasses because of the changes in the winter. Carcasses are spread out throughout the year.
More so.
As opposed to just in the spring.
Yeah.
We have a lot more bears now. And there's certainly a lot more bison. And bison carcasses are a really big deal for bears, too. So, and they will take them from whoever has them.
Yeah.
And they don't last very long.
Yeah.
Good questions, Chris.
Joe, can we talk about bears in the winter here for a minute? Is that your next question?
It actually was my next question.
See?
That.
Yeah, so, bears go into den because of the difficulty of finding food in the wintertime. They don't go into den because they don't like cold weather. They go in because they can't find much to eat. If you eat, the majority of your diet is vegetation and insects, with some things that die, having to do little foraging in the winter is a really evolutionarily advantageous thing to do, and so they go into the den. And what we see now with these changes in the winter precipitation and snow is that we see bears going in later, and in some cases coming out earlier. And so their time in the den is less. And as I talked about here, there's an overlap with the time bears are out and these aggressive methods to kill wolves. Last year we had a significant number of bears out in December in places where they were trapping for wolves with snares and traps. And we asked the management agencies to change the dates of the wolf trapping season in response to the change in the weather, and we didn't even get a response from them.
Really?
But the need for flexibility in management is really important, because if we see these animals out at the same time that the wolf trappers are out, that conflict is going to lead to dead bears, and the only way to stop that is to change the time that the wolf trappers and snarers are on the landscape. And everything we see certainly indicates that they're going in later, particularly big males, and therefore they're more vulnerable to conflicts with wolf trappers.
You know, in terms of wolf trapping and bears being ensnared in wolf traps, talk about that. I mean, what kind of numbers are we looking at there, and how significant is it?
Well, it's very difficult to find that out, because there is no incentive at all to report if you've caught a grizzly bear in your wolf trap. Because if it was well known that grizzly bears were being caught in wolf traps, there would be public pressure to stop wolf trapping in those places. And so the people that are wolf trapping have a disincentive to report that. And these trapping activities happen in the backcountry away from anyone else, so it's not a public activity. So we have very little information on that. We do know that grizzly bears are caught in traps. We do know that grizzly bears are caught in snares. We know of at least 3 grizzly bears that have been caught in neck snares that were set for wolves. And that's just the ones we know about. So the tip of the iceberg is the worrying part, because if you have baits on the landscape, particularly in late fall, early winter, when there's not a lot out and the bears are very interested in anything that smells good, they're going to be attracted to those sites where there are snares and traps, and they're going to be at high risk of being caught.
Yeah, I want to get into, I see where you're going with this, and I think, especially, Doug, you and you, Chris, have worked for the federal government. Things can happen slowly or not at all, and getting things done, if anybody worked with any agencies, it could take a bit. But, I guess a sort of segue into that a little bit was just, the fact that you mentioned in your opening remarks that, grizzly bear numbers are not sufficient to delist at this stage.
Well, just let me correct that. Just numbers alone are not sufficient. We've
Right.
got a lot of grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem, for
Sure.
example, and they're already limiting their growth rate because they're a density regulated species. Their, subadult survival and cub survival drops as the density of bears increases. And so they regulate their own numbers, and they're doing that in the Yellowstone ecosystem now. But numbers alone are not
numbers alone.
sufficient
Right.
to talk about delisting these animals.
Well, then, expand on that a little bit more about where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is in the discussion about delisting grizzly bears from protections under the Endangered Species Act, and therefore transferring management, power to the states. Where are we at?
Okay, just a brief review of that. The three states, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, all petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service about 2 years ago to delist grizzly bears. Wyoming's petition was the Yellowstone ecosystem. Montana's petition was essentially the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Much of western Montana would remain listed under Montana's petition. Idaho's petition was that the grizzly bear should have never been listed under the Endangered Species Act in the first place, because bears south of Canada are not a significant number of grizzly bears, and therefore not a significant portion of its range, and that it was listed in error. And therefore grizzly bears south of Canada should not be listed anywhere anymore. That was Idaho's petition. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service took Idaho's and Montana's position or petitions, and they're evaluating those now to decide whether to proceed or not. They rejected Idaho's petition, but Idaho has recently relitigated that and has said that they want their petition reconsidered, and that would be delisting grizzly bears everywhere south of Canada, because they never should have been listed. And the review process is ongoing. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been taking a long time to do that. They basically have a year to do that. They're beyond the year, and I believe Wyoming has filed a lawsuit to get that decision done in the near term. So that's where it is right now. 3 different petitions. Fish and Wildlife Service is evaluating those petitions based on all the information they have, but they have not yet made a decision.
Yeah, it becomes complex when you have that potential transition of management control from a federal government to these individual states, and we've seen that sort of all over, politics and lawmaking in various forms. Well, Doug, let me follow up with you on that. The Fish and Wildlife Service in '78 listed most gray wolves as threatened in the U.S. They were then removed from the Endangered Species Act protection in 2021. Talk about where wolves are today in the endangered species discussion, and just emphasize, or I guess clarify.
Well, they're listed everywhere except here.
Right, except,
and that was done by the Biden administration a couple of years ago. And that's because wolves were delisted here through legislative action. It was a rider on a budget bill, which makes litigation bulletproof. You can't litigate it because it was done legislatively, not through the process of the Endangered Species Act. And so that's why the Northern Rockies is the only delisted wolf population in the U.S. right now. All the others are listed. And this dovetails with Chris's opening comments. He did a nice job of itemizing the change in management regulations done by politicians, as he said, legislatures, I believe in 2021, which liberalized killing wolves. And so that addresses one of the reasons for listing a species, which deals with regulatory mechanisms in place to protect the population. And so when, interestingly, I'll back up, the proposals to delist, and Chris's third point was, you need to have state management plans that are approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service. At the beginning, Wyoming had the worst plan. And it was deemed unacceptable by the Fish and Wildlife Service. That was litigated. That was solved by this budget rider. But since then, Wyoming hasn't done much. They've just kept to their plan. And now, Idaho and Montana, who originally their plans were in the review process were considered better, have regressed in their plans. And now they may be worse than Wyoming's, who came out poor to begin with, but held the line. And all the regulations he itemized is why. And that was done through the legislatures. And what that triggered, similar to what Chris just said, was the Fish and Wildlife Service saw this and did a status review. And a status review is you evaluate if the population should be put back on the endangered species list. And the Fish and Wildlife Service did that because of these changes in regulations, which addresses, are there enough protections in place? So in colloquial terms, this was a shot across the bow of the states, saying, we don't like what you did. In the end, they did nothing. The status review determined that there were enough wolves that they didn't need to be relisted. And so that's the situation for wolves right now. Some people complain that the number of wolves that was signed off on is so low that the onus on the states to prove that they have an adequate number is, you don't have to do, it's 10 packs for each state. And to make sure it never hits 10, all each state needs to demonstrate having is 15 packs. So, 3 times 15, 45 packs, roughly, that's not that many wolves. That's roughly 450 wolves approximately. And Idaho and Montana alone predict they have more than 1,000 wolves in each state. So they don't have really great population estimates because they don't need to. And so they're not even close to the relisting mark. So a lot of people say for a long-term sustainable population similar to the grizzly bear, that number needs to come up. And that will be extraordinarily hard to do because that's called moving the goalposts. The original final rule was signed off on as 3 times 10. And if someone comes along and says, that's not a long-term viable population, it needs to be higher, that will trigger massive social upheaval, lawsuits, et cetera. So getting it to what I think would be an appropriate population target is a political process, and that'll be very difficult to do. But right now, the states don't have to manage for very many wolves. So that means you don't need to have a very good population estimator to say that you have that many. And that was all built in because of the 1987 recovery plan. So.
And they're trying to manage down. Idaho's trying to go from about 1,200 wolves or so down to 150.
Yeah.
That's their plan.
Yeah.
And Montana has maybe about 1,000 wolves, and they would like to get down to 450. And through all the means that I listed on the board, there are all these new and innovative ways to kill wolves. And then unfortunately, Wyoming has what's called the predator zone outside, where anything goes.
Right.
Wolves can be killed anytime.
Unregulated, yeah.
In any way.
Yeah.
And the fear for grizzly bears is that the states, if they were given control of grizzly bears, would they do to grizzly bears what they're currently trying to do to wolves? And they've certainly shown us who they are. And again, I want to say who is doing this. It's the politicians in the states, not the state biologists. I have nothing but respect for the state biologists in the fish and game departments. It's the politicians that are making these decisions to drive the wolves down to nothing and ignoring the needs of grizzly bears.
Yeah, that's those numbers are pretty striking.
Yeah.
So you were just in Italy. How many wolves are in Italy?
Okay.
Yeah, how many?
I had to attend a wolf conference in Italy. Almost didn't go 'cause it's a
You had
long
to
way,
go,
but they twisted my arm, and I did go. There's 3,500 wolves in Italy, and
60 million people.
And this is remarkable. In 1973, a friend of mine named Luigi Boitani began studying wolves, and in the entire country, Italy had about 100. And it's 60 million people, and so wolves and people live essentially on top of each other. And tolerance is hard won, but they've got much more rigorous, detailed management. That 3,500 number is a very good population estimate. Because they have to have a good estimate to be able to manage the wolf-human interface adequately. I don't want to get into our political system versus theirs. Their tax rate's higher. I realize that's a four-letter word here. You can't use it. But that gives them more money to do a good job estimating the number of wolves they have. So they have a very robust system to give you a good idea of how many you have and where you have, so you can direct management action towards problem areas. I'm not going to say it's perfect. There's still illegal killing of wolves, because wolf tolerance has been an age-old problem. There's still livestock killing, but it's very hard to get permission to kill a wolf. Hunting ungulates is highly regulated. It's a very different system here, but because there's a lot more people, you need more money. You need to invest in wildlife management more because you've got more problems. There are problems, but there's still 3,500 wolves in a very densely populated region. This is northern Italy, the Alps, and down the peninsula into the Apennines and the Abruzzi Mountains. The parks there have high use, livestock grazing, so wolves go up into the alpine tundra for their rendezvous sites. I don't know any wolf pack in Yellowstone that goes up into the alpine for their rendezvous sites, and they do that to get away from the people. So I could go on and on about this, but wolves and people can live together, but it takes more investment, both in terms of time and money and tolerance to do it.
How do they deal with the livestock killing? Because when I think of Italy, I think of cows and sheep at all elevations.
They have robust, and a big part of this conference was about non-lethal ways to avoid depredations. They are very aggressive with shepherding, guard dogs, fladry, not turning your livestock out in free-range situations. They will do that, but they do it in a appropriate timing, season, time of day, shepherding, guard dogs. It's much more intensive livestock management, stuff that in the U.S., if you said to anybody, they'd look at you like, what planet are you from type thing. Well, it's not a different planet, it's a different continent, but they had many sessions at this conference on non-lethal management to reduce depredations. When a depredation happens, they don't immediately kill the wolves either. They're getting to a point where the critical mass of the number of wolves is they're going to have to start discussing that as well. But keep in mind, not everybody in Europe carries a gun with them all the time. And so killing wolves just out there in the field is not everyday occurrence like it is here in Wyoming. Everyone's got a gun.
They don't run them down with snow machines.
And that, as far as I know, that does not happen at all in
Italy.
Italy or all of Europe, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's go.
So,
Sorry.
Joe,
go
I'd like to bring one issue up, and
Yeah.
we're talking about the issues with wolves and bears and the complications that are on these species and managing them. And the climate issue that Cathy brings up is this huge blanket of uncertainty that covers wolves and bears and the way they can live in this ecosystem with all these people. And on top of the climate change, we have more and more people moving into this place who are occupying all this land and recreating on the public land. And if the bears are coming out earlier, which they're probably going to do if the precipitation in the spring is increased and it's warmer, that means they get flooded out of their dens and they have to come out.
Yeah.
And as they come out in the spring, there's not a lot for them to eat. And
Yeah.
as they go downhill, they're running into more and more people and all the things that people bring with them: barbecues, gardens, garbage, beehives, bird feeders, all those things that are in places the bears have to be at low elevations in the spring. So this whole climate change thing is, it's a multiplier of impact
It is.
for bears
Yeah.
on the landscape.
I mean, the thing that frustrates me is that climate change is usually not at the table when management decisions are made, because management decisions are made for such a short time scale maybe, or they're responding to the crisis of the moment. But climate change really needs to be part of any planning exercise, planning the best habitat for wolves or grizzly bears, or as well as thinking about land use change. But climate change is often just it's often at a different conversation with different people. And that's really concerns me, because this whole ecosystem is in the process of being transformed by climate change.
Do you think people admit to the climate change?
I
Facts?
just think it's a different channel. It's like, oh yeah, and then there's climate change is happening, but we've got this immediate problem, so let's plan for that. But do we have the right bear management areas? Do we have the right, wolf numbers in the right places? Is climate change being considered in any of those discussions?
And from my point of view as a manager, you have the imminent issues, the things that are going to eat your lunch in the next couple years. And then you've got the things that are further out, which is climate change. And you tend to think of that, we'll solve that later. But it's something that is not going to be solved later in many cases.
I was thinking about driving my fossil fuel car. You know when the tank is empty and you need to stop right away and put some gas in, or it won't go any farther. Well, that's what you're facing with grizzly bears and wolves. But you also know that you have these long-term maintenance issues that are going to come and get you in the end. And I think people are fully capable of dealing with problems on multiple time scales, and we just haven't really created the space for that.
Well, I think we are also at the same time, thinking about what people are being referred to as climate refugees, coming from spots where maybe there is more imminent dangers of, Florida, southeast, the Florida coast, and hurricane issues. And flooding, the growth, especially in the last 3, 4, 5 years, COVID was a big factor, but movement into this area is explosive. I think that, I'm curious to hear what you guys think about, there is some imminence there. I mean, it's not necessarily this, we don't believe in climate change, or I don't believe in climate change necessarily because I don't see it in my doorstep. However, it's hitting people's doorstep.
I think living with more and more people is actually a climate change issue in this region, because visitation every year since 2015 is almost every year has been a new record, and people are coming here because where they live is terrible in the summer. It's too hot, it's too dry. Why wouldn't you go to Yellowstone? And then why wouldn't you move to this ecosystem? Because it's pretty nice. There's a lot of amenities. That's climate change.
And we did a workshop about 15 years ago on the effects of climate change on grizzly bears. We did it with our Canadian colleagues. And the end of that workshop, grizzly bears are opportunistic omnivores, right? They eat a lot of different things. They switch it, and they're pretty flexible in many cases. You know what the biggest threat that everybody, all the biologists in that room came up with that was going to threaten grizzly bears due to climate change? That's all the new people that are going to move into grizzly bear habitat to get away from Phoenix and Tucson. And on top of that, that was before the COVID issue and the fact that everybody could work from home. You can work in Los Angeles and work out of your house. I have people up the street from me who built several $million-dollar houses who work in Los Angeles, and they never leave Missoula. And they're on every day, Zoom calls, and they never leave. They were never here before COVID. And all those people are moving in here now, which is constraining the resilience and the flexibility for grizzly bears on this landscape. Because as they would go out earlier in the spring because they're getting flooded out of their dens because it's warmer, they could go to lower elevations and find places where there's going to be green growth. But in many of those places now there's homes and people. And nobody's tearing houses down. And so this increase in humans on the landscape due to climate change and due to COVID is really constraining the resilience and flexibility of the system for animals like grizzly bears.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I think that, you know, talking about the amount of people here, you know, I want to move on just a little bit here to how, I mean, first off, there's an elephant in the room, of course, but talking about predator-human conflicts a bit, you know, Doug, you know, in February, and you all know this very well in Jackson and in Wyoming, Tony Roberts walked into a bar in Daniel, Wyoming with a muzzled wolf. He had run it down with a snowmobile, tortured it, and then shot it. Doug, how did that make you feel? Talk about like what the...
I mean, you know, angry and indignant, but I hate to say this is an age-old problem for wolves. I mean, people have been torturing wolves for hundreds of years, but that needs to stop. And I think, you know, the most important thing I thought of about this event coming here is, you know, you always want to leave with, what do you do? What's the next step forward? And for wolves, it's so much based on social issues with humans, it's hard to plot that out. This particular case, it's not. That is unacceptable. It's repugnant. It's animal cruelty. It's not hunting. It's not sporting. It's not fair chase. So that needs to be cleaned up in all 3 states because it's done to coyotes and foxes as well. And this is easy. I can say this because I'm not talking out of both sides of my mouth. I'm a hunter. I'm into clean take. I'm into not making the animal suffer. It has a chance. This is not that. I personally think, and I know when outsiders criticize anybody in Wyoming, people dig in. But I think this makes hunting and the state look bad. And so I think it needs to be cleaned up. That's a first step towards, I think, future wolf management in the region. And I think Idaho and Montana has to deal with this as well because it's called whacking and it's more common than you think. I think Chris has got more cases that occur about it, but people do it with coyotes more commonly, even sometimes with foxes. This is just, if you ask me, not appropriate human behavior at all. And it makes legitimate hunting, harvesting animals look horrible as well as the state. And so this, I'm going to be watching because this should be an easy fix. And if nothing happens, that sends a message, a chilling message. But this one, whenever I talk about wolf management, it's super nuanced. It's like, oh boy, what about this? What about that? Overlay social tolerance onto it. This issue is not that.
You know, Chris, to follow up on that, you know, how does Wyoming, how does and sort of by proxy, Montana, Idaho, how do they not do anything about this? I mean, how does that, I mean, Doug just said, it makes the state look bad. It makes the hunters look bad. I mean, this idea of clean take, and then, we're going to run wolves and coyotes over with snowmobiles because they don't feel pain is one thing that we were talking about before, what some people say. How do the states not address this?
I don't know. I mean, it's barbarism, and it's unbelievable. There was a bill introduced by Mike Phillips in the Montana legislature to make it illegal to run over coyotes, and run over coyotes and canids of any kind with a snow machine. And they wouldn't even listen to it in committee. It never even got to committee. That's in the Montana legislature. Now, I don't know what the Wyoming legislature is going to do, but, in Montana, less than 20% of the population buys hunting and fishing licenses. That means that 80% of the population of Montana does not hunt or fish at all. And the people that hunt big game, I think, is in the neighborhood of, in the United States, it's less than 5%. And hunters are a minority. And if we, hunters, cannot clean up our act and the way we treat animals, then we probably don't deserve to have the rights we have to deal with animals like they're happening now. That's wrong. And it's not something that's going to take a lot of thought and well, maybe we would need to think about that. Or, I mean, who in their right mind could defend this as something that it should happen in a modern day civilized society? It does not make any sense at all. It should be an easy fix, as Doug said. So we'll see what the Wyoming legislature does. And it's totally legal in Montana and in Idaho to run over coyotes and foxes and wolves with snow machines right now. And it happens a lot more than we think, believe me, a lot more. All the time it happens. And there are groups of people that do it every weekend for sport. Anyway.
Yeah, well, I do have a couple more questions, but at this point, I'd love to, if anyone in the audience is, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
I'd love to open it up for a couple questions. You're the only one I can see currently, but there you are. You've got a mic coming your way.
No?
Oh.
Is it working? Okay, great. So Doug and Chris, you both mentioned political division. You both either directly or indirectly mentioned road ecology. And it seems that more than anything else is gaining the most bipartisan support through infrastructure, what it might be. Have you seen other bipartisan support for wildlife policy and protections?
You can take that one. Rarely. It doesn't happen very much. The road issue is really a unique one. It's probably due to the billions of dollars we all pay on our auto insurance because we kill over 1 million animals a year. We hit over 1 million deer a year in North America. And all the damage that we do to our automobiles, we pay for that in our insurance rates. And I think there's human safety values too. I don't know how many 100 people are killed. No, it's pretty uncommon to see that kind of bipartisanship. And, it's nice to see it. I wish it was in other places too.
Right here in the back. That guy. Pointing at yourself. Yes.
So within the 399 film and tonight, it was kind of discussed about how the vegetation will affect grizzly bear foraging. And obviously it's not as big of a dependent for wolves because they have a pack that can take down an animal. But do we see any issues or impact on energy levels of grizzly bears not being able to take down animals because they can't forage as much due to the dryness of vegetation?
Okay, your question involved maybe they don't have enough energy to catch an animal. Grizzly bears are really ineffective carnivores, and so they don't catch many things. Most of the things they eat, they found dead already. They catch elk calves for about 2 weeks until the elk calves are too quick. I think another part of your question is, are there changes in vegetation to the point that we're seeing changes in in grizzly bear health or reproduction or survival. And there was a very detailed study done on that in 2015 by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, which is basically USGS. And they could not see any big changes in the way bears were using vegetation and how that affected things like survival or initiation of reproduction. Most of the things that were related to changes in survival were related to the density of grizzly bears. So as the density increases, subadult survival decreases, and that was due to the density of bears, not so much a change in foods. Now, is that going to be that way forever? I don't know. And we do know that whitebark pine has declined in the Yellowstone ecosystem, for example, but the study team, USGS, couldn't measure any impact of that change over time on grizzly bears. Grizzly bears just switched to other foods. And remember, whitebark is a food that doesn't produce every year. So some years it produces a lot of cones, some years it doesn't produce any. And in those years that it doesn't produce many at all, the bears eat other things. So they were used to food switching with something like whitebark. But in general, we haven't seen any big vegetation changes due to this with grizzly bears. Again, it's nuanced. You know, we talk about the idea of climate change. In the spring, if the bears are coming out earlier, things would have to green up earlier. And if things are not greening up earlier, then the foods may still be there, but they're just not green when the bears need it. And that's something that's worrying for all of us. Are they going to have green foods when they come out, if they're driven out of their dens early by warm temperatures? So that's a big question mark right now.
It seems to me like bears are, I mean, they're one of the most adaptive animals around if given the chance. But I still worry about the loss of whitebark pine because it's a high elevation species, you know, where you want bears to be protected from people. And it's in the middle of this core protected ecosystem. And we've lost it. We've lost a lot of it, 50% mortality or more. And in a few decades, the estimates are that there'll be 97% gone from Greater Yellowstone. So all that's doing is forcing the bears to take this high protein food loss and go somewhere else. And they're going to lower elevations where people are. So I don't think we can completely dismiss the importance of losing whitebark pine on the grizzly bear population. I mean, yeah, they do eat a lot of different things, and they are looking for other things to eat. But it's going to have an impact, I think, on the ecosystem as a whole.
I don't think anyone would dismiss the idea that whitebark is gone, but trying to understand what has happened to the bears with whitebark, they couldn't measure any differences in changes. Now, it's interesting that if you look at we're talking about the Yellowstone ecosystem, but if you look at the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, the Glacier Bob Marshall complex, whitebark is functionally extinct in that ecosystem due to blister rust. Grizzly bears used to eat whitebark all the time up there. There's over 1,000, well, there's over 1,100 bears in that ecosystem, and they're very healthy without any whitebark pine at all. And they used to eat it all the time. There's all kinds of historic records where they ate it in the 50s, the 40s. So that's an example of an ecosystem where it completely disappeared, yet the bears seems to be doing fine. There's a lot more huckleberries there, but you know, there's all these subtleties going on.
Yeah, you add to that changing the time of berry production and, as you say, the time of green up, everything's going to be changing. And so it's so important to keep every food source we can.
All the parts are really important. Everything is important.
Chris, you know, real quick, you know, just along those lines, you know, we're seeing what amounts to more grizzly bear and human conflict in, you know, certain areas. Jackson Hole's front news of the weekly and the daily seems to be a new situation quite regularly. What, you know, if it isn't in part, and maybe it is in part whitebark, but what is causing that? What is driving bears either to lower elevations where humans tend to be, or is it just that there are more humans and it's back to that growth thing and development that we just they can't turn left or right without avoiding us?
Okay, it's a good question. First of all, the grizzly population has increased over time. You know, we started with about 200 bears. Now there's about 1,000 or so bears in the system. But that population has started to stabilize because of the density of bears subadult survival has declined. Cub production and cub survival has declined because of the density of big males, essentially.
Right.
On top of that, so you have more bears on the landscape. On top of that, you've got more people. What is the latest visitation in the park as an example?
5 million.
5 million. So there are a lot more people on the landscape as well.
Yes.
So you've got more bears and you've got dramatically increased numbers of people. So the encounter frequency is higher. And I just want to stress, as we bear biologists, when we see conflicts, we see people mauled or attacked, we try to figure out what they were doing and what was happening. In almost every case, the people that are suffering from these maulings and fatalities, which are terrible, and that's not something that is trivial at all, but almost all these people are doing what we tell people not to do, okay? We tell people to hike in groups. We tell people to carry bear spray. We tell people to, not run. We tell people to make noise. Almost in every case, you can go and look and see at all the things that the person was doing that did not meet those criteria. And, there are ways to be safe recreating in bear country and to be careful recreating in bear country. And if you go to any sign at any trailhead in Yellowstone Park, they're laid out. All those details are laid out. If people followed those, there would be a lot fewer fatalities. And
So it's a literacy rate problem.
I think it's just a question of, people saying, well, that won't happen to me, and I mean, that's the famous last words, it won't happen to me. I've been in grizzly country a lot. I know about grizzly bears. It's crazy how people do this. They can, it's the minimization of risk. There's a whole risk analysis scenario that goes with this, that people say, well, it won't happen to me, and it happened to somebody else, but I'm careful, and I know what's going on. And invariably, those are the people that run into these situations, Running in the backcountry alone is really a dangerous thing to do. Yeah. You can't do that successfully for a long time. You might, doing something stupid and getting away with it is not a prediction of future success.
Nicely said. Questions here? Right here. Young lady?
I get the box.
You do.
My question is for Doug. So, a little bit of a lighter topic. So, the average lifespan of a Yellowstone wolf is like 4 to 5 years, and Wolf 907 just gave birth to a litter of pups, and she's 11. What do you think that says to the outlook of the longevity and lifespan of wolves in Yellowstone?
Well, for one, reproductive senescence hasn't been documented for wolves. I mean, it appears she's to my knowledge, the record. I mean, elk kind of switched to alternate year reproduction after about 12 or 13. Wolves don't seem to shut down. Now, part of that is, and I didn't do a very good job in my introductory comments about this, but wolves have a quick life. Their life history is designed around fast. The life history of a grizzly bear is designed around slow and longevity. So wolves live life in a hurry. They have young every year, bears don't, cougars don't. They start breeding at a young age. Bears don't. I don't know about cougars, but wolves suffer high mortality even naturally because of interpack. It's amazing. The leading cause of mortality for wolves in Europe is humans. They still kill each other. Wolves are hardwired to kill each other. They evolved that way. So what they were selected for was living life in a hurry. Everything happens fast. And so, yeah, most wolves in like Idaho, Wyoming, Montana live probably 2 to 3 years. There's no data on that, but 80% of the cause of mortality of wolves outside of Yellowstone in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming is human caused. So they're dying because of people, and they're not living long. So if you're a female and you have 1 or 2 litters, that's what you're going to get. And so wolves living to 5 or 6 is for a protected area data, and this is Canada and Alaska as well. So 907 is a true outlier. You know, now she missed some years in there, but she's still going at 11, but that's still really, really old. For a bear, and Chris will probably correct me, but they're just getting going at 10 or 11, you know, if you're a female. Wolves, that's the record holder. And so I think that's the cloak, besides climate change, over everything. When you're dealing with wolves compared to bears and even cougars, the big carnivores in North America, wolves just have this life history strategy that is totally different. And we've taken advantage of that. We've taken advantage of that because you can kill them at a high rate and they bounce right back because they have a history of death in their evolutionary history. But I am bothered by us using that as an excuse for heavy-handed killing, because the one aspect that we don't ever consider is they live in family groups. They are social, and the killing really rearranges that. Now, they bounce back reproductively, but they don't socially. In fact, we have some data, it's not great, it's hard to get at, but after a lot of mortality, it can be up to 10 years until the social structure kind of gets back to its natural situation. I realize I wandered a little bit on that answer, but, you know, 907 is not a normal situation with a wolf, but it's remarkable because it's still a data point. So, yeah, hopefully I got close to your answer. Yeah. Okay, great.
Oh boy, that's we'll go here. Yeah. The box is making its way. Thanks, Chris.
Hey, thanks, you guys. This has been really fun. Cathy, you mentioned fire early on in your talk, and with fire severity and probability increasing. Is that still expected to increase between now and 2100? Are there predictions about that? Because I would like to hear from Doug and Chris, how is increasing fire severity going to affect wolves and bears? You know, some species do well with fire, some species don't.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, because there's so much talk about what do we do about wildfire now, and you know, the conditions projected by the climate models suggest that we're going to get more and more wildfires, right? Because summers are getting drier, there's less moisture in the air, the fields are drier, and you've just set up the conditions for large fires. And we've seen that trend since the 1970s. I mean, we thought 1988 was a big deal in Yellowstone, and we've seen larger fires ever since. So fires are definitely going to increase. There's a lot of proposals for how we're going to deal with fires, fuel treatments, that sort of thing. Really, we just have to think about where we live. We have to learn to live with fire, because I don't think we're going to be able to stop it. But we also have to think about where we put our buildings and who's responsible for that decision. To me, we have this wildland-urban interface that we're all living in. And it's the place where all the animals are going, right? Because they've lost their food sources and so on. And it's exactly where people are living and where we're going to get more fires. And gosh, we've got to get that interface right. We've got to figure out what we're going to do about that.
Yeah, Doug and Chris, do you want to chime in?
I'll be brief. It'll probably help wolves. I mean, deer and elk are the primary prey of wolves in the Northern Rockies, and a recently burned forest is great habitat for deer and elk. Grassland, when a fire goes through grassland, the effects are usually 3 to 5 years of increased productivity, and it smooths out to its pre-fire stage. Moose, it might hurt because moose are highly dependent on old growth forests, and the loss of old growth will probably hurt moose, but moose are not a big prey item in the Northern Rockies for wolves. Maybe a little bit. There's some areas around here that Kevin Monteith has worked on and Grant Teton has worked on with moose, but it probably in the end will either not impact or help.
But let me just catch you there. Well, I mean, what would happen if you lost a lot of your forest in Yellowstone, and if you converted forest to grassland because you had so much fire and trees couldn't regenerate and species, you just lost a lot of areas of forest. What would happen to your wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's an open question. I don't know the answer to it, but elk, most of the elk in Yellowstone live in the northern part of the park, and it's primarily a shrub steppe grassland. And so if you're converting forest to shrub steppe grassland, you might be helping elk, because of high fire frequency. But I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for grizzly bears, early phenological stages are generally more productive for bears. And if you have a mosaic of different ages and structure on the landscape as a result of fire, then you create a diversity of foods for bears. And so they're well adapted to living in places that have been burned. If you look at old growth forest or places that are protected from fire, in general, they're not very good bear habitat. But if you have a catastrophic fire, let's say that you call the '88 fire a catastrophic fire, I don't believe there was any measurement of negative impacts on grizzly bears from the '88 fires. They just seemed to do fine. No bears died because of the fires, and a lot of foods came back. So, I mean, bears are pretty well adapted to fire. But
even if you lost a significant amount of forest cover, it would be fine for bears. They'd be fine.
Oh, yeah, they do really well in diverse habitats. Early phenological stages generally are more productive because you get more sunlight on the ground. You get a lot of more forbs and grasses, and bears do really well in forbs and grasses. So. And so do deer and elk that bears eat. So,
Interesting.
Joe?
Yeah. Sorry? Oh, got it.
This is,
It's coming
this has
from over there. Sorry.
been a good discussion about the ecology and the position in the ecology of the local area that I really appreciate myself. But I have a question and then an introduction. The question is, why should people, this has been a great discussion about the animals. And I think most people in this room really care about the animals that we're talking about. But why should our population work to maintain this balance? And we were talking a lot about the state's position in this. And I'd like to introduce to you Liz Storer, a newly appointed chair of the committee in Wyoming that's going to be addressing the wolf issue, and I assume she's here to hear what you guys have to say.
Hi, Doug. Thanks, Sandy, I think. So I'm Liz Storer. I'm a representative from here in Jackson, Teton County, House District 23. I serve on the Travel, Recreation, and Wildlife Committee. And we did meet a couple of weeks ago in Cody, and we really had a situation where the governor, the federal land managers, and the Game and Fish Commission all said that this was a legislative issue for us to try to address the incident in Daniel with Cody Roberts. So my committee chairs did step up and asked Director Nesbitt from Game and Fish to brief us. He also briefed us on their annual report on wolves. And we took a bit of public comment, and most of us also listened to the rather extensive public comment that was taken by the Game and Fish Commission a few weeks earlier. At that point, it wasn't clear what was going to happen, but at the end of the day, partly in my suggestion that we do move forward with a subcommittee to take on this issue. And so I kind of got voluntold into it a little bit, and since I said I was willing to do that, and so I do have it will be a working group because it involves both legislators and non-legislators. And I was handed my committee, and I was handed an assignment. That assignment was very narrowly defined, and I don't think it reflects exactly what we're hearing with the conversation we just heard tonight, as well as what I think we're hearing from the public. So I'm coloring outside the lines a little bit, but I also have to recognize that I work with a lot of conservative folks, and what I'm really going to try to do is have a conversation and bring some of the collaborative processes that have worked to bring people together on issues in the past to that process. Also had a friend of mine give me Barry Lopez's book of Wolves and Men, so I've been reading that. I think I will also be sharing that with my committee members and assign them some chapters. It's a great history for all of us to reflect on. And I've just been reaching out to each of my committee members. Those committee members are 3 of my colleagues and legislative colleagues, the director of Ag, the director of Game and Fish, a staff member from Wyoming Wildlife Federation, and the executive director of the stock growers and the governor's office. So it's not particularly well balanced, and I pointed that out. But we're going to ask some other voices to come in and talk to us. The first meeting still isn't scheduled. We hope to have that in the last week of June. It's probably going to be in Lander. It will be public. We probably will not take public comment at that meeting.
Ms. Storrow, thank you very much. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No, I just, Sandy wanted me to talk about it.
Oh, okay, well, no, thank you so much. No, and it's important what you're doing.
Let this group of people know about it.
Oh, yeah, no,
Thanks
that's
for the update.
excellent.
Appreciate that, Liz.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you all very much. This has been a fantastic evening. I've one quick question. I'd love to give each of you, one last question, give each of you 30 seconds or so to answer. And it's not a simple one. And as Doug said earlier this evening, these issues aren't so black and white. There's a lot of nuance involved. And so this is a bit of a tough one, but we'll start with you, Cathy, and we'll go to you, Doug, and then you, Chris. Try to keep it short if you can. It's not black and white, but is the future of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem bright or is it bleak?
I think it's changing. I study the past, and I've seen how it's changed throughout its history. So we are, living in interesting times where an ecosystem is quickly changing, and whether we give it the space to change, give animals the space to move around and respond to the changes that are going on, it is going to be up to us. That's our responsibility in the game.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I have to answer that by saying I don't know. And the reason I say that is I had to give a talk last fall in Jackson here. And preparing for that talk, I talked with the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, Cam Shawley, as part of my research. And I was in the camp that the future is not bright because of the things Chris stated, development and population pressure. And Cam Shawley, he probably wouldn't like me mentioning this, shot back and said, how can you say that when 70% of it's protected public land? And so because of that, I will say I don't know, and it's a toss-up.
Dr. Servheen.
That's a tough question.
It's very tough.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, we've shown our abilities to fix things that were broken. And grizzly bears and wolves to some extent. And the fact that they are on the landscape in the numbers they are today in Yellowstone is an example of what we can do to fix things. Can we continue that? I think if we all put our mind to it, we could do the right thing for these animals, and we could provide a healthy ecosystem we could manage recreation on the public lands so that it didn't exclude the animals that have to live there. We all have to remember that we're recreating in their living room every day, and they don't have any other place to go. And so we need to be thinking of them when we put advanced and enhanced recreation on the landscape. I think we have the ability to make the right decisions to make Yellowstone a really healthy place, and that it would continue to be a healthy place both for people and the animals that live here. The question is, in this political climate that we have today, can we go beyond the polarization that we see and have the bipartisanship that was mentioned by that one question in the back about we see on highways? Can we have bipartisanship to do the right thing for the health of the Yellowstone ecosystem? I think if we got to that point, we could make the right decisions. We're going to have this uncertainty of climate change always considered. But we could do the right thing. Whether we will do the right thing or not, I don't know.
That's a good answer. Thank you, guys. That was a tough one, I think. Doug and I had that conversation the other day, and I thought I'd bring it up. But, well, look, folks, thank you really very much for coming out. It means a lot to us. Thank you to our distinguished panelists. Thank you to our sponsors, Greater Yellowstone Coalition and EcoTour Adventures. As a parting thought, I got this today because I'd like to share a quote that my father sent me yesterday. It's an excerpt from this year's Brandeis University commencement address given by the documentarian Ken Burns. It's a reminder to put our egos aside and to recognize the power and the beauty of nature and what we have here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's a reminder to listen to wild places and to each other. So here's the quote from Ken Burns. He said, "Be in nature, which is always perfect and where nothing is binary. Its sheer majesty may remind you of your own atomic insignificance, but in the inscrutable and paradoxical ways of wild places, you will feel larger and inspirited." Thank you all for coming tonight. Good night.